Welcome to another story on the Sleepy Scrolls. Prepare yourself for the journey ahead. Find a quiet spot, lower the lights, and make sure you are settled in comfortably. Breathe deeply, let the world around you fade away, and allow your mind to drift into a place of peaceful calm. Tonight, we will explore an era of the past when traveling was not the simple affair it is today. In fact, in ancient times, roads were a nightmare to travel. The paths that connected distant cities and empires were fraught with dangers, discomforts, and obstacles beyond imagination. It was a time when a journey could take months instead of days, where the roads themselves were often just as dangerous as the places they led to. So, if you're ready to unwind, and perhaps feel a little more connected with the ancient world, I invite you to listen closely. And if you find yourself intrigued by tonight's story, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps this story to continue unfolding. Now, let us begin, and let the gentle rhythm of this tale guide you into rest. The road less traveled. In the world we live in today, the idea of travel seems almost too simple. We hop into our cars, board our planes, or maybe take the train to our next destination. The roads are smooth, paved, and marked, guiding us along with ease and convenience. But imagine for a moment a time when a road was not merely a path to your destination. Imagine a time when a road was an uncertain journey into the unknown, a test of endurance, a constant reminder of the fragility of human will. Ancient roads were vastly different from the highways and byways we navigate today. These roads were not designed for comfort or speed. They were built for a much darker, more utilitarian purpose. And yet, for the travelers of the ancient world, these roads were the only means of connecting distant cities, cultures, and empires. They were the veins that pumped life into the ancient world. Yet they were also the source of great suffering, danger, and hardship. The roads of ancient civilizations were often not much more than rough, uneven paths etched into the landscape, carved through mountains, across rivers, and over treacherous terrain. In places where civilization had yet to flourish, the idea of a proper road was a luxury few could afford. Instead, people traveled by foot, on horseback, or by cart, often following natural trails carved by centuries of use, or simply forging their own paths through dense forests and untamed wilderness. These roads were narrow, winding, and far from the smooth highways we take for granted today. But despite their crudeness, they were essential. These roads, though unforgiving, provided the only means for people to connect with one another. Consider the roads of ancient Rome, for instance. The Roman Empire, one of the greatest civilizations in history, understood the importance of roads. They built a vast network of roads that stretched across the empire, connecting Rome with its farthest reaches. Roman roads were marvels of engineering, featuring a base of stone, gravel, and sand, topped with large, flat stones that made the surface as smooth as possible. Yet, even the finest Roman roads were still far from perfect. They often sloped too steeply, were prone to flooding, and, in some places, were little more than muddy tracks. And though Roman roads were among the best of their time, they were still a nightmare to travel, particularly for those without the comfort of a well-maintained carriage. The early roads of the ancient world were far more primitive, often no more than dirt paths, trampled by countless feet, animals, and carts. The lack of modern engineering tools meant that roads were carved out in ways that seemed to disregard both comfort and practicality. Curves and sudden changes in elevation were commonplace, and travelers had little choice but to follow the route that had been carved out over centuries. These roads were built with no thought to the modern comforts of travelers. No thought was given to maintaining a smooth surface, to making the road easy to travel. The roads were not built for ease, they were built for necessity. Imagine traveling along such roads, day after day, with nothing but the harsh landscape around you, and the weight of your journey bearing down on you. It was not just the physical hardship that made ancient roads so grueling to traverse. It was the emotional and mental toll that came with them. The road was a constant reminder of how far one was from home, from safety, from civilization. Each mile seemed longer than the last, as if the road itself was mocking the traveler, reminding them of how small they were in the face of the vast, unforgiving world. But still, people traveled. They traveled because they had to. They traveled to trade goods, to expand empires, to wage wars, or simply to explore the unknown. And for those who traveled these roads, the experience was often not one of adventure or excitement, but of exhaustion, fear, and frustration. There was no guarantee of success, no assurance of safety. For every traveler who made it to their destination, there were countless others who never did, lost along the way, swallowed by the unforgiving land. It wasn't just the roughness of the roads that made them such a challenge. The very idea of a road in ancient times was something that was at odds with nature itself. Roads cut through forests, over rivers, and across mountains. They carved paths through the natural world, disrupting the landscape and creating new challenges for those who dared to walk them. In some places, the roads were little more than a series of wooden planks laid across boggy ground, or a series of stone steps cut into the side of a mountain, making travel a slow, exhausting process. The people who traveled these roads did so with the knowledge that they were walking into danger. These roads were not just difficult to navigate, they were often life-threatening. The very nature of ancient roads made them the perfect breeding ground for bandits, marauders, and other dangers. With few rest stops, no guarantees of safety, and no way of knowing what lay ahead, travelers were constantly on edge, always alert, always wary. A journey that should have taken days could stretch on for weeks, and those who set out on these roads often had no idea whether they would make it to the end. And yet, for all the dangers, for all the hardship, these roads were essential. They were the lifelines of the ancient world. Without them, civilization would have been isolated, disconnected, and unable to thrive. It is easy to imagine ancient roads as mere inconveniences, but in truth, they were vital arteries that carried life itself. Trade, culture, ideas, armies, and much more, across vast distances. The roads were not just paths, they were the threads that connected the diverse peoples of the ancient world, linking them together in a web of shared history, commerce, and interaction. But what made these roads particularly nightmarish was not just their roughness, nor the distance they demanded travelers to cover. What made these roads truly daunting was their unpredictability. No two journeys were ever the same. The weather could change without warning, turning a dusty road into a quagmire of mud. The seasons could turn a dry path into a treacherous stream, making what was once passable impossible to traverse. The roads were shaped by nature, by the seasons, by the whims of the gods, and by the ever-changing needs of the people who used them. It was this unpredictability that made ancient roads such a nightmare. Travelers could never be certain of what they would encounter, and even the most experienced could not predict the challenges they would face. A road that had been passable yesterday could be impassable today. The journey, therefore, was always a gamble, and every step taken was one filled with uncertainty. This uncertainty was compounded by the sheer length of many ancient roads. These were not the small, winding streets that we are familiar with today. Some roads stretched for thousands of miles, crossing entire empires, linking the capitals of nations, and carrying with them the hopes and fears of civilizations. The roads were long, arduous, and often deadly, making the journey itself a test of strength, endurance, and will. Yet, for all the challenges, the roads served a critical purpose. They allowed the flow of goods and ideas, connecting far-flung regions and opening up new possibilities. The Romans, for example, built their roads with the military in mind, creating efficient routes for their legions to travel quickly across their vast empire. These roads, though difficult, were essential for maintaining control, for facilitating trade, and for spreading Roman culture and influence. But the roads were not just about utility. They were also a symbol of power. The very act of building a road was an assertion of control over the land, a way of marking one's presence on the earth. The road was a way of saying, "We have conquered this land, and we can traverse it at will." In this sense, the roads were not just pathways. They were monuments to the power and reach of the civilizations that built them. As you can see, the roads of the ancient world were far from the smooth, paved highways we know today. They were harsh, dangerous, and often soul-crushing. And yet, they were also the lifeblood of the ancient world, the essential pathways that connected the far corners of the earth. It was on these roads that the great empires of history, Rome, Persia, Egypt, and many others, left their mark, their stories forever etched into the very stones beneath their feet. So, as we journey forward through this tale, consider the hardships those ancient travelers endured. Think of the strength and resilience required to traverse a world that was as much an obstacle as a path. And perhaps, just perhaps, you might come to appreciate the comfort of the roads we now take for granted. If you're still with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think you would have fared on such a journey, with nothing but the vast and unpredictable land before you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more sleepy stories. Ancient roads, a blend of necessity and hazard. In many ways, ancient roads were the very embodiment of contradiction. They were essential, the very foundation upon which civilization stood. Yet they were also hazardous, fraught with dangers that made any journey an ordeal. Roads connected cities, facilitated trade, and allowed armies to move across vast territories. But to travel those roads was to face the unknown, to venture into a world that was, at best, unforgiving, and, at worst, deadly. The necessity of roads in the ancient world cannot be overstated. Without them, empires would never have expanded beyond their own borders. Trade would have stagnated, cutting off the flow of goods and culture between civilizations. Rome, for example, owed much of its power and influence to its extensive network of roads. The famous Roman roads, stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, allowed the empire to maintain control over vast distances. These roads were the arteries that carried not just goods and soldiers, but also ideas, philosophies, and innovations. They were crucial for communication, for the expansion of empires and for the survival of civilizations. Yet, for all their importance, these roads were not made with the traveler's comfort in mind. The people who journeyed on these paths were often at the mercy of the landscape itself. The roads twisted through rugged mountains, across deserts, and along treacherous rivers. There was no standard for construction, no blueprint for a safe or efficient route. The very nature of ancient roads meant that travel was unpredictable, and the journey could change from one day to the next. What was a well-trodden path one day might be an impassable mire the next. And in the days before modern transportation, the burden of travel fell solely on the traveler. As you journeyed along the ancient roads, you were constantly reminded of your vulnerability. The roads were not designed for comfort, but for function, often to connect places of military or strategic importance, rather than centers of leisure or rest. And because of this, the traveler was often alone, far from the safety of walls or towns, forced to rely on their own resourcefulness and luck to survive. Consider for a moment the ancient roads of Greece, winding their way through rugged hills and forests. The land was beautiful, yes, but also wild and untamed. The roads were carved into this landscape, as though the earth itself had reluctantly yielded to human intervention. The traveler would often find themselves clambering over rocks, navigating steep inclines, and fording rivers with nothing more than a sturdy walking stick or a mule to guide them. These roads, though essential, were rarely easy, and every step was a reminder of the relentless forces of nature that sought to impede progress. Even the roads built by the great civilizations, such as the Romans, were not immune to the challenges posed by the natural world. The Roman roads were designed for efficiency, to allow the rapid movement of troops and supplies. But these roads were still vulnerable to the elements. Heavy rains could turn even the best-laid roads into rivers of mud, slowing the passage of caravans and soldiers. The Romans, masters of engineering though they were, could not control the weather, and the roads they built were as subject to nature's whims as any other. But it wasn't just nature that made ancient roads hazardous. The roads themselves were often plagued by thieves, bandits, and marauders who would prey on unsuspecting travelers. These robbers were as much a part of the ancient world as the roads themselves, and they knew the paths well. They knew the places where travelers would be most vulnerable, where the roads narrowed, where rest stops were few and far between, and where the next town was miles away. Travelers had to be constantly alert, always watching over their shoulders, ready to defend themselves at a moment's notice. And even if they survived the journey, the risk of being robbed or worse was ever present. The roads, in many ways, became a mirror of the civilizations that built them. The great empires, like Rome, constructed roads with a certain level of grandeur, their smooth stones and meticulously planned routes reflecting the power and control that these empires wielded. But beneath this facade of order lay the harsh realities of life on the road. While the roads may have connected distant lands, they also exposed the vulnerability of those who dared to travel upon them. A journey that seemed straightforward could quickly turn into a nightmare if the weather changed, if a band of thieves appeared on the horizon, or if a simple misstep led to a fall that could leave the travelers stranded in the wilderness. The early roads of other civilizations were no less daunting. In ancient Egypt, for example, roads were built to link cities and temples, but they were often little more than narrow paths carved through the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, and travelers had little protection from the harsh elements. The journey was slow tedious, and dangerous. The lack of water was perhaps the most significant hazard, as travelers would often find themselves running low on supplies, with no means of replenishment, until they reached the next oasis or settlement. Even in places where the roads were more developed, such as Mesopotamia, travelers still faced tremendous hardships. The roads were often poorly maintained, and travelers had to deal with floods, unpredictable terrain, and the constant threat of disease. The lack of sanitation and proper medical care meant that a simple injury could become life-threatening. A sprained ankle, for example, could keep a traveler from continuing their journey, leaving them vulnerable to the elements or to the predators that roamed the wilds. And yet, despite all these hazards, people continued to travel. There was no choice. The roads, despite their dangers, were the lifeblood of ancient economies. Without them, trade would have ground to a halt, communication would have been severed, and armies would have been stranded. The roads were not just a means of getting from one place to another. They were essential to the functioning of society itself. When you consider the roads of the ancient world, it's difficult not to wonder about the travelers who braved them. What must it have been like to set out on a journey, knowing that the road ahead would be full of unknowns? The journey would have been a test of patience, endurance, and willpower. But it would also have been an adventure in its own right, an opportunity to see the world in a way that few others could. Perhaps, as you listen to this story, you might reflect on how you would have approached such a journey. Would you have walked confidently, trusting in your ability to overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead? Or would you have been cautious, aware of the dangers, but determined to reach your destination? These ancient roads were not just paths, they were journeys of self-discovery, testing the limits of human resilience. The travelers who undertook these journeys were in many ways pioneers of the human spirit, carving out a path through the unknown. The challenges of terrain. As we continue our journey through the ancient world, one of the most significant obstacles faced by travelers of the past was the very land they traversed. The terrain itself was both a natural marvel and a relentless adversary. Mountains, deserts, rivers, and forests each presented their own unique set of challenges, transforming a simple journey into a test of survival. The first challenge, perhaps the most formidable, was the mountains. In the ancient world, a mountain range was not merely a scenic backdrop to the landscape. It was an impenetrable barrier, a force of nature that could delay or even end an entire journey. In the times before modern engineering, travelers had no choice but to navigate through the jagged peaks and deep ravines of mountains, often without the aid of proper roads or infrastructure. The Romans, renowned for their architectural genius, built roads through some of the most treacherous mountain ranges in Europe. But even their expertise could not smooth the paths entirely. The climbs were steep, the air thin, and the weather often unpredictable. Imagine, if you will, the daunting task of crossing a mountain range. The air would be sharp, biting, and cold, even in the warmth of summer. The path would wind and twist, often disappearing around sharp corners, leaving the traveler uncertain of what lay ahead. The ground would be uneven, strewn with loose rocks and crumbling earth, making each step a challenge. As you climbed higher, the temperature would drop, and the wind would howl through the peaks, pushing against your body with every stride. For those unprepared or ill-equipped, these mountains could be deadly, leaving travelers exposed to the elements with no shelter in sight. It was a slow and painful struggle to make any progress, and for those who grew weary, the mountains offered little mercy. The path through the mountains was often long and perilous, stretching on for days, weeks, or even months. Every morning brought with it the hope of progress, and every evening brought exhaustion. Yet, despite these hardships, the mountain roads were vital. For empires like Rome, they were a means of connecting territories, allowing soldiers to march across hostile lands, bringing control to the furthest reaches of the empire. For traders, these mountain routes provided access to distant markets and goods that could not be found elsewhere. And for adventurers and explorers, the mountains were the boundaries of the known world, beyond which lay mystery, danger, and opportunity. But mountains were not the only challenge faced by travelers. The vast deserts, with their endless stretches of sand and scorching heat, were just as unforgiving. In regions like Egypt, Persia, and Arabia, the desert was not merely a barren wasteland. It was a living, breathing entity, as full of dangers as any mountain range. Travelers who ventured into the desert did so with the knowledge that they were entering a hostile environment, where survival was not guaranteed. The sun would beat down mercilessly during the day, baking the ground beneath, while at night the temperature would plummet to freezing levels. The desert's vastness made navigation difficult, as landmarks were few and far between. Travelers could easily lose their bearings, wandering for days in search of water, food, or shelter. The sand itself posed a particular challenge. It shifted and moved, reshaping the landscape with each passing gust of wind. What might have been a clear path one day could be buried the next. The roads through the desert, if they could even be called roads, were little more than faint tracks left by the feet of those who had gone before. There were no roads as we know them, no markers or signs to guide the way. Instead, the traveler had to rely on the stars, the sun, and the knowledge of the land passed down through generations. The scarcity of water made every step in the desert feel like a gamble. The traveler could march for hours, days even, only to find the next oasis dry, the water long gone. Every traveler in the desert carried with them a vital supply of water, but even that could run out quickly in the sweltering heat. For many, the journey across the desert was a race against time. It was a struggle to find the next watering hole, the next source of relief. And if a traveler ran out of water before reaching safety, the consequences could be fatal. The desert was not only harsh in its physical demands, it was also a mental and emotional challenge. The isolation was overwhelming. There were no bustling cities, no villages to offer a sense of security. The traveler was left to their thoughts, alone in the vast, empty expanse, with only the sounds of their own footsteps and the occasional cry of a distant animal to break the silence. It was a landscape that seemed to stretch on forever, offering no comfort, no respite, just the ever-present threat of nature's unforgiving power. But even the desert, in all its harshness, had its role in the ancient world. It was the land through which caravans of merchants and traders carried their goods, silk, spices, and precious metals across vast distances. The desert was the lifeblood of trade routes, connecting the ancient civilizations of the East with those of the Mediterranean. Without the desert roads, the flow of goods between East and West would have been almost impossible. The desert roads, difficult as they were, connected the world in ways that would shape the course of history. In addition to mountains and deserts, travelers also had to contend with the great rivers that cut through the ancient world. These rivers, like the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, were the lifeblood of civilizations. They provided water, food, and transportation. But they were also barriers, particularly when the rivers were swollen with rain or snowmelt, turning what were once safe, easily crossed streams into violent torrents. Rivers were a challenge for ancient travelers in more ways than one. First, there was the danger of crossing them. In the absence of modern bridges, travelers had to rely on ferries, rafts, or even the strength of animals to carry them across. A wrong move could send a traveler or their belongings tumbling into the river, where they would be swept away by the current, often never to be seen again. The riverbanks themselves were often treacherous, eroded by constant flooding, leaving unstable ground that could collapse at any moment. But even if travelers were able to cross these mighty rivers, they still had to contend with the vast swamps and marshes that often surrounded them. These areas were filled with stagnant water, mud, and thick vegetation, creating a maze of obstacles for those trying to move forward. Travelers had to wade through the muck, risking infection and injury from the sharp reeds or poisonous creatures that lurked in the shadows. Forests, too, presented their own set of challenges. While they might have provided shelter from the sun or the elements, forests could also be dark, disorienting places. The dense canopy above blocked out much of the light, and the path through the trees could be unclear, leaving the traveler to wander for hours in search of a way forward. In these forests, animals such as wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed freely, and there was always the threat of attack. And then there were the insects, the biting flies, mosquitoes, and other pests that would swarm travelers, making every step a struggle against nature's forces. Despite all of these obstacles, travelers still made their way through these rugged landscapes. With determination and skill, they adapted to the challenges of terrain, carving paths where none existed, and finding ways to overcome the land's obstacles. These roads, whether through mountains, deserts, rivers, or forests, were a testament to human resilience. And even though the journey was often fraught with danger, the roads they built laid the groundwork for the civilizations that would come to shape the world. As you sit here, listening to this tale of ancient roads, think for a moment about the challenges that people faced just to go from one place to another. The terrain, the weather, the uncertainty, everything worked against them. And yet, despite all of this, they pressed forward. Perhaps in their struggles, you can find a parallel to your own experiences. How often do we face seemingly insurmountable obstacles in our own lives, only to find the strength to overcome them? The ancient roads, in all their difficulty, were not just pathways, they were trials, tests of the human spirit. As you reflect on these harsh terrains, consider this. In our modern world, we often take the ease of travel for granted. But there was a time when the road itself was a journey fraught with uncertainty. If you think about it, what do you think would have been the hardest terrain for you to face? Would the mountains have been too much? Or perhaps the endless stretch of desert would have drained your will? Reflect on the challenges of ancient travelers, and as you do, think of how you might have faced such a daunting journey. The burden of travel without maps. In today's world, navigation is something we often take for granted. A simple glance at a phone or a GPS device is all it takes to find the quickest route, to know exactly where we are and where we need to go. The comfort of clear signage, modern maps, and satellite navigation means that our journeys, for the most part, are straightforward. But imagine a time when such luxuries did not exist, when the only guide to your destination was the uncertain terrain beneath your feet, the occasional traveler you might encounter, and your own sense of direction, however flawed it might be. In the ancient world, the concept of a map as we know it was nearly non-existent. To navigate the vast stretches of land between cities and across empires was to rely on memory, hearsay, and the fleeting indications of the landscape. The traveler was often left to their own devices, wandering in search of their destination with little more than a general sense of where they were heading. And even if they had a rough idea, the journey was fraught with uncertainty. There were no clear markers to guide the way, no signs to indicate how far they had come or how far they had left to go. In the absence of maps, travelers often depended on landmarks, natural features like mountains, rivers, and forests, or the sun and stars to find their bearings. But such markers were not always reliable. The landscape could change quickly, and landmarks might be hard to identify, especially for those traveling through unfamiliar regions. A mountain range might look different depending on the angle or the weather. A river could shift its course after a heavy rain, making it impossible to follow the same path again. Even the stars could be obscured by clouds, leaving travelers in the dark, both literally and figuratively. For the ancient Romans, who were among the most skilled at road building, maps existed in some form, but they were not as detailed or as accurate as what we have today. The Roman world relied heavily on written descriptions of places, often passed down through generations of travelers and merchants. The descriptions would give vague directions like head west from the city, follow the river for a few miles, and then turn left at the large oak tree. But these directions were imprecise, and without a clear map, they were often open to interpretation. The paths described in these accounts could be outdated, altered by the forces of nature or human development, leaving travelers with the task of finding their own way. One of the most significant challenges of ancient navigation was the absence of standard routes. Roads were not laid out in the neat, predictable manner we have today. Each journey was a unique experience, a path that had to be discovered anew with every trip. The roads themselves often had no clear direction, no straight line leading from one place to another. Instead, they would twist and turn, veering off course to avoid obstacles or to follow the natural contours of the land. And even where a road did exist, there was no certainty that it would take you directly to your destination. The roads were not marked with signs indicating the next town or village, and the traveler could not simply follow a road to its end with the assurance that they would find what they were looking for. For the ancient Greeks, the roads between their city-states were often more like trails than actual roads. The cities of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth were separated by rugged hills and valleys, and the roads between them were often little more than well-worn paths through the mountains. Travelers would follow these paths, often relying on the local population for guidance, or simply using their best judgment to navigate. For a long time, these paths were simply suggestions, not guaranteed routes that could be relied upon. Many travelers had to go through a series of trial and error, backtracking and reevaluating their choices as they moved forward. Beyond the lack of maps, ancient roads presented their own navigational challenges. For one, the roads were not always well maintained. Sections of the road could become overgrown with the vegetation, washed away by floods, or eroded by years of use. What had once been a clear path might become nothing more than a vague impression of a road, a suggestion of where one might travel if they were lucky enough to find it. This was especially true in regions where the roads were not well established, such as in the countryside or in the less developed parts of ancient empires. In these areas, a traveler could easily lose their way, wandering aimlessly until they stumbled upon a settlement or found another traveler to help guide them. The absence of reliable markers made travel not only difficult, but dangerous. Without clear directions, a traveler could find themselves deep in unfamiliar territory, unsure of which way to go. The fear of getting lost was ever present, and it was a constant source of stress for those who journeyed on these roads. Even the most experienced travelers could be thrown off course, with no way of knowing if they were heading in the right direction. For many, the challenge of navigation was a matter of survival. Getting lost in the wilderness could mean running out of food, water, and shelter, or even encountering wild animals or bandits. In some ways, though, the lack of maps and clear routes made the journey a more personal experience. The absence of rigid guidelines forced travelers to rely on their instincts, their observations, and their interactions with others. It was a journey that involved not only the landscape, but also the people you met along the way. As travelers made their way across vast territories, they encountered different cultures, different languages, and different ways of life. The road was a place where one could learn, adapt, and grow, where the very process of getting lost could lead to unexpected discoveries. But it also meant that every journey was a gamble. Even if the road was well traveled, there was always the risk of becoming disoriented. And in the ancient world, getting lost was more than an inconvenience. It was a potentially life-threatening situation. Travelers were often alone in unfamiliar lands, with no one to rely on but themselves. And yet, despite the constant risk, people continued to travel. They relied on the wisdom of those who had gone before them, and they trusted in their own resilience to find their way. As you listen to this, think for a moment about the challenge of navigating in such a world. Imagine walking through a dense forest or crossing a barren desert with no idea if you're heading in the right direction. You'd be forced to rely on your senses, your instincts, and your faith that the road will eventually lead you to safety. How many times have we felt lost in our own lives with no clear map to follow? Yet, as we continue to walk, we often find our way, one step at a time. The roads of the ancient world were not just physical paths. They were also metaphors for the journeys we all take in life, full of uncertainty, but also full of possibility. The lack of safe rest stops. Imagine a world where rest was not a given, where every pause in your journey, every moment of respite, was uncertain, whether it would be long enough to restore you or short enough to keep you on edge. In the ancient world, stopping for rest on the road was often a luxury, one not afforded to every traveler. Unlike today, where we can pull over to a highway rest stop or check into a comfortable hotel for the night, ancient roads provided few such opportunities. The roads were grueling, the pace was slow, and rest was never guaranteed. In fact, rest was more of a necessity than a comfort. When we think of ancient travel, it is easy to romanticize the idea of wandering across the lands, experiencing new places and peoples. But in truth, the reality of travel in those days was harsh and exhausting. Most roads offered little in terms of safety or comfort. The idea of a safe, clean, and secure place to rest was foreign to to those who ventured along the rough and unpredictable paths of the ancient world. Unlike the well-placed inns and rest stops we find today, the ancient traveler had to make do with whatever shelter could be found along the way, and often that shelter was far from ideal. Rest stops in many places were no more than crude shelters or open fields where travelers could lay down for a few hours, hoping for a moment of sleep. These rest stops weren't constructed with comfort in mind. They were simply places to stop and catch a breath before continuing on the journey. For those traveling with animals, the situation was no better. Horses, mules, and donkeys, which were essential for carrying goods or people, also needed rest, food, and water. Yet, finding a place to properly tend to these animals was often just as difficult as finding a safe place to rest for oneself. In the Roman Empire, certain roads were equipped with designated stopping points known as mansiones. These were places where travelers could rest and refresh themselves, but even these were far from luxurious. The rooms offered little more than basic shelter, and the food provided was often nothing more than a simple meal, not the hearty, restorative feast we might imagine. Many travelers did not have the luxury of staying in mansions. Instead, they relied on inns or temporary shelters along the roadside, if they were fortunate enough to find one. And even then, the inns that did exist were often overcrowded, uncomfortable, and barely safer than the road itself. But rest was not just a matter of comfort. It was also a matter of survival. Travel in ancient times was physically demanding, and the absence of proper rest could have severe consequences. The constant wear and tear on the body could lead to exhaustion, dehydration, and illness. When people traveled long distances without proper rest, their bodies began to break down. The lack of sleep alone was a serious issue. Sleep, especially during long and arduous journeys, was often a rare commodity, and the quality of sleep was far from ideal. A traveler might rest for a few hours on the hard ground, with nothing more than a cloak or blanket to shield them from the elements. The noise of the road, whether it was the sound of animals or the distant rustle of leaves, would keep them alert, preventing a deep, restful sleep. There were also the dangers of rest stops themselves. Stopping on the side of the road in an isolated area could expose travelers to all sorts of risks. It was easy for bandits or robbers to target vulnerable travelers, especially those who were camped out at the edge of a forest or in a desolate field. Even when inns or rest stops were available, travelers could not be certain of the safety of the place. Thieves might be waiting for them in the shadows, or worse, the innkeeper could be a criminal in disguise, charging exorbitant fees or leading them into a trap. In some regions, such as the deserts of Egypt or the steppes of Asia, finding a safe place to rest could be even more difficult. The land itself was unforgiving. The scorching heat of the sun during the day could quickly turn a simple rest into a life-threatening situation. Travelers had to rely on the sparse oases or well-known watering holes, but these could be miles apart, and if one was missed, the consequences could be dire. The few places where rest was possible were not guaranteed to offer protection from the heat or the cold, leaving travelers exposed to the elements. The nights, though cooler, could bring their own dangers, as wild animals prowled in the dark, and the winds would howl through the barren landscape. But it wasn't just the terrain that made rest difficult. It was also the lack of food and water. In ancient times, provisioning for a journey was a delicate art. Travelers had to carry enough supplies to sustain them for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the distance. However, food and water were not always easy to come by. A traveler might run out of provisions long before reaching a town or village, and without proper rest stops to resupply, they could quickly become weakened by hunger or thirst. And even if supplies were available, the quality of the food was often poor, with stale bread, salted meat, and water that could be contaminated or stale. The psychological toll of such travel was often just as challenging as the physical toll. The knowledge that there would be no comfortable bed waiting for you at the end of the day, no warm meal to ease your weariness, weighed heavily on the minds of travelers. The uncertainty of where and when the next opportunity for rest would come only added to the mental strain. Travelers often had to push through exhaustion, knowing that each step took them further away from the safety and comfort of their home, yet there was no turning back. The journey had to continue, and the search for rest would remain an ongoing struggle. As you think about these ancient travelers, consider what it might have been like to go days, perhaps weeks, without a comfortable bed or a secure place to rest. What might it have felt like to sleep on the cold ground, with nothing but a thin blanket and the open sky above? Perhaps the constant fatigue would have made every step feel heavier, every mile longer. But despite these hardships, people continued to travel, driven by necessity, adventure, and ambition. They understood that rest was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival, and they pushed on through exhaustion, knowing that each day brought them closer to their goal. As we reflect on the hardships of rest, one might wonder, how would you have managed such a journey, knowing rest would be so rare and fleeting? Would you have been able to endure the lack of comfort, the uncertainty and the exhaustion, all while navigating the ancient world's rough roads? Roads as a reflection of power and control. In the ancient world, roads were not merely functional structures built to ease the passage of people from one place to another. They were symbols of power, tools of control wielded by empires who assert dominance over vast territories. To travel on these roads was not just a practical necessity. It was to acknowledge the authority of those who had constructed them. The very existence of these roads spoke of an empire's reach, its ability to bend the landscape to its will, and its determination to maintain order across immense stretches of land. Consider for a moment the Roman Empire, perhaps the most successful and well-known example of road building as a political tool. The Romans understood the importance of roads in maintaining their empire, not just as a means of transportation, but as a powerful statement of imperial control. Roman roads were not simply created to connect cities. They were designed to extend Roman influence into the furthest corners of the empire. They were the veins through which the empire's heart, in Rome, pumped its lifeblood, connecting disparate provinces, armies, and peoples. Roads in the Roman world were as vital to the empire as the soldiers who marched upon them, and they were built to last for centuries. Roman engineers were masters of their craft. They constructed roads with precision, using layers of materials that would ensure the roads remained durable and functional for centuries. These roads were wide, straight, and well-maintained, stretching across the known world. A Roman road was a work of art and a tool of subjugation. They were not just designed for ease of travel, they were designed to reinforce the power of Rome. Every step taken on a Roman road was a reminder of Rome's power, its engineering prowess, and its unyielding control over the land. But the Roman approach to roads was not limited to the physical aspects of construction. These roads also carried a deeper, more subtle message. The very act of constructing roads was a demonstration of Roman authority. To travel upon these roads was to submit, in a sense, to the empire. The roads represented the power of the emperor, the might of the Roman military, and the discipline of Roman society. The roads were the embodiment of Rome's promise. Travel would be possible. Movement would be allowed, but only under Roman control. For those who dared to oppose Rome, the roads were not just a means of movement. They were a reminder of what could be lost. The roads connected the distant reaches of the empire, allowing Roman legions to move swiftly from one region to another, suppressing uprisings, putting down rebellions, and reinforcing Rome's dominance over its provinces. A journey on these roads was often a journey under the watchful eye of the empire. For any rebel, any dissenter, the roads were just as much a tool of subjugation as they were a way of connecting the vast empire. A local uprising, no matter how powerful it might seem, would be crushed by the sheer weight of the Roman military presence that could be moved quickly along these roads. The roads were highways for conquest, control, and the propagation of Roman culture. In the case of the Roman Empire, the roads were not only a symbol of control, but also an expression of Roman identity. The roads connected Romans to one another, forging a bond that transcended the individual. As you traveled along these roads, you were not just a person moving from one place to another. You were part of something greater. You were traveling along the very paths that connected the greatness of Rome. The act of traveling on Roman roads was not just about reaching a destination. It was about participating in a grand narrative of empire, of dominance, and of civilization itself. Roman roads were the very foundation of the Pax Romana, the period of relative peace and stability that allowed the empire to flourish for centuries. Beyond the Romans, other ancient empires also recognized the importance of roads as a means of exerting power. The Persians, for instance, constructed the Royal Road, which spanned over 1,500 miles, connecting the vast territories of their empire from Susa in Persia to Sardis in Asia Minor. This road, though not as intricate as the Roman roads, was equally vital for the Persians. It allowed for efficient communication and the swift movement of soldiers and messengers, enabling the Persians to maintain control over their sprawling empire. The Royal Road was more than just a path. It was a symbol of Persian unity, connecting the diverse cultures and peoples within the empire. Much like the Roman roads, the Royal Road was not simply a means of getting from one place to another. It was a tool of governance, a reflection of the Persian Empire's reach and influence. In ancient China, the construction of the Great Wall was mirrored by the creation of roads that traversed the empire. These roads were built with military objectives in mind, allowing the Chinese to move soldiers quickly to defend against invasions or internal rebellions. The Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes, was also integral to the exchange of goods and ideas, and it too was a tool of control. The roads that stretched across the desert, through mountains, and over rivers were as much about the flow of goods as they were about the spread of Chinese influence. These roads connected China to the wider world, allowing it to assert its presence and dominance in Asia and beyond. Yet, despite the grandeur and significance of these roads, they were often not built with the comfort of the traveler in mind. The roads that served as instruments of power were rough, narrow, and dangerous. The very act of traveling along these roads was an acknowledgement of the hierarchical structure of ancient societies. The roads may have been smooth, straight, and wide for the elite, but for the common traveler, the roads were often fraught with danger, discomfort, and uncertainty. The roads were built for the powerful to maintain their grip on society, not for the ease or safety of the average traveler. For the ordinary person, traveling on these roads was a precarious undertaking. They might encounter bandits, wild animals, or natural obstacles that could turn a journey into a life or death struggle. The roads themselves were often poorly maintained in more remote regions, with sections that were impassable due to floods, storms, or simply the passage of time. Yet, despite these challenges, the roads remained vital for trade, communication, and military purposes. For every road that was poorly constructed, another was built to further the power and influence of the empire. And so, the roads of the ancient world were both a reflection of civilization's greatest achievements and a reminder of the harsh realities that came with power. These roads connected the elite to their dominion and allowed empires to maintain control over vast territories. The traveler, then, was both a participant in and a witness to the power dynamics of ancient civilization. As you listen to the story of these roads, consider for a moment the scale of the power they represented. The roads were more than simple paths from one place to another. They were the threads that held empires together, that connected distant lands, and that ensured the authority of rulers. In many ways, to travel on these roads was to acknowledge the vastness of the empire that created them, and to submit to the power and order that these roads represented. The dangers lurking on the road. The ancient roads were far from the benign pathways we may imagine them to be today. The journey was fraught with countless dangers that could turn a simple trip into a life-threatening ordeal. To travel on these roadstones was to expose oneself to the whims of nature, the cruelty of hostile forces, and the lurking dangers of the unknown. Every step taken on these paths carried the potential for disaster, and the traveler had to remain ever vigilant, for it was often the unpredictable threats that were the most perilous. One of the most obvious and immediate dangers was that of bandits and robbers. The roads of the ancient world were rarely patrolled by authorities, and travelers often found themselves vulnerable to criminal elements lurking in the shadows. Bandits would lie in wait near bends in the road, in dense forests, or at the edges of towns, ready to ambush anyone who came into view. The ancient roads were often isolated, stretching for miles with no towns or villages to offer refuge. This made the traveler an easy target, particularly for those who were alone or traveling with valuable goods. Bandits were not the only threat lurking on the road. Thieves and highwaymen were a common danger, but there were also more organized and ruthless forces that preyed on travelers. In some regions, marauding groups or even entire armies would attack travelers to seize supplies, loot, or simply to strike fear into the hearts of those who might resist. In the case of the Roman Empire, for example, it was not uncommon for foreign invaders to use the roads as avenues of attack. These enemies of Rome knew that the roads were crucial for the empire's movement and communication, and they would often target travelers, caravans, and convoys to disrupt the empire's supply lines. For the ancient Greeks, the danger of bandits was no less severe. Traveling along the winding roads that cut through mountains and forests, one was never far from the threat of attack. A lone merchant or traveler could be ambushed at any time, and the robbery would often result in far worse than just the loss of possessions. Travelers could be tortured, held hostage, or even killed if the bandits were particularly cruel. The Greeks knew these dangers all too well, and their journeys often had to be carefully planned to avoid known bandit hotspots. But even then, there was no guarantee of safety. Even if a traveler managed to avoid the threat of robbery or violence, other dangers were just as deadly. In many parts of the ancient world, the roads were plagued by wild animals, predators that would stalk travelers and pounce at the most vulnerable moments. Wolves, bears, and lions were common in parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they would often roam near roads in search of food. To encounter one of these beasts could mean death. Travelers would have to travel in groups, carrying weapons for defense, but even then, the threat of an attack was always present. The ancients learned to carry sharp tools and weapons for protection, but these encounters were no less terrifying for it. In some regions, particularly in remote or desert areas, there were also more insidious threats, poisonous creatures such as snakes, scorpions, and spiders. These dangers were often hidden from view, lying beneath rocks or burrowed in the ground, waiting for an unwary traveler to step too close. The venom from a snake bite or a sting from a scorpion could incapacitate or kill a person within hours if not treated, and in some areas, the closest source of help was miles away, leaving travelers to face these dangers alone. While animals and bandits posed immediate physical threats, the dangers of the road were not limited to these visible, tangible risks. The roads of the ancient world also carried the threat of illness and disease. Without modern medical care or hygiene, any journey could quickly turn into a battle for survival. Water sources along the road were often contaminated with bacteria, and travelers who relied on streams, rivers, or wells for hydration were at risk of contracting illnesses like dysentery or cholera. Even if a traveler carried their own water, the heat and the demands of the journey often led to dehydration, which weakened the body and made it more susceptible to infections. Food was another significant risk. Ancient travelers often had to rely on preserved foods, salted meats, dried fruits, or stale bread that could easily spoil if not properly stored. In areas where food was scarce or hard to come by, travelers might go days without a proper meal, weakening their bodies and making them vulnerable to illness. The lack of proper nourishment could also lead to malnutrition, which would further drain travelers' energy and stamina. The harsh conditions of the road, combined with inadequate food supplies, meant that the journey itself could slowly wear a traveler down, turning what should have been a straightforward trip into a long and grueling battle to stay alive. Even the very roads themselves were often dangerous. Flooding, erosion, and other natural disasters could alter the landscape, transforming a familiar path into a treacherous obstacle. Storms, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions were constant threats, and these events could quickly change the course of a journey, trapping travelers in areas that were no longer passable. The ancient world was a place of unpredictable and violent forces, and those who traveled on its roads were often at the mercy of nature's whims. For those traveling in regions with harsh climates, the weather itself could become a deadly enemy. In the deserts of the Middle East or North Africa, the searing heat during the day could be unbearable, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. During the night, however, the temperature could plummet, leaving travelers freezing in the dark, exposed to the elements. In areas of high altitude, such as the mountains of Greece or the Andes in South America, the cold, thin air made travel incredibly difficult. Altitude sickness could cause nausea, dizziness, and difficulty breathing, and the traveler had to endure the pain of climbing with each step, often in the freezing temperatures of the night. It was a constant battle against the climate, which could go from unbearable heat to bone-chilling cold in a matter of hours. The toll on the mind and spirit was just as severe as the physical dangers. The isolation of ancient roads was often overwhelming. In an era when towns were scattered and settlements few and far between, a traveler might find themselves days, weeks, or even months away from home, with no contact from loved ones or allies. The loneliness was constant, and the fear of the unknown loomed at every turn. For travelers, the road could feel like an endless stretch of desolation, a journey that tested not only their bodies, but also their mental resolve. The very idea of venturing out into the unknown was an act of bravery, and each day on the road could bring new fears, whether from the creatures lurking in the dark, the thieves hiding behind the trees, or the very elements themselves, which could change at any moment. Yet, despite the constant threats and dangers, ancient people did not stop traveling. They continued, driven by necessity, curiosity, or ambition. The dangers on the road were real, but so was the reward of reaching the destination. For the people of the ancient world, the road was a path not just to a physical place, but to something deeper, a journey of survival, of discovery, and of resilience. They faced the same dangers that modern travelers face, whether physical threats, emotional strain, or the toll of nature's unpredictable power. But they did so without the luxury of modern tools, maps, or comfort. As you sit here, drifting into the tale of these ancient travelers, consider what it must have felt like to walk these roads, knowing that danger was a constant companion. How might you have faced the bandits, the animals, the illnesses, and the climate? What would you have done when the road seemed too much to bear? Perhaps, in the end, the road was not just a way to travel from one place to another. It was a test of endurance, a challenge to the spirit, and a testament to the resilience of the human will. Reflecting on the dangers of these ancient roads, what do you think it would have been like to face them with nothing but your courage and your wits to rely on? Would you have been prepared for the constant threats that came with each journey? Or would the dangers have been too overwhelming? The ancient road networks, limited yet vital. In the vast theater of the ancient world, the road was a thread, fragile, fraying, and imperfect, linking together the hearts of cities, the edges of empires, the smallest of villages, and the furthest outposts of civilization. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to think of these ancient road networks as sprawling and complete, like veins in a body, nourishing every limb of an empire. But the truth was far more modest. The reach of the roads was limited. Many regions, even within mighty empires, remained remote, disconnected, or virtually unreachable for much of the year. And yet, for all their limitations, these roads were absolutely vital. They were the lifelines of the ancient world, narrow, precarious, and precious. Let us imagine what a road network actually looked like in antiquity, not on the polished maps and textbooks, but in the dust and stone of reality. A merchant in the Roman world could, in theory, travel from Britannia to Syria, or from Carthage to Gaul. But this idea, while technically possible, would have been a fantasy for most. The journey would have taken many months, perhaps even years, assuming the roads held, the weather cooperated, and danger did not strike. Roads were not interconnected in a comprehensive grid, but rather spidered out from key cities like spokes on a wheel. Between these primary arteries lay a vast terrain of unmarked paths, foot trails, goat tracks, river crossings, and sheer wilderness. A road might connect two towns reliably, but anything beyond that was left to guesswork and luck. Even within the bounds of an empire as organized as Rome, the road network was shaped not by convenience, but by necessity, military, political, and economic. Roman roads served Roman purposes first. This meant connecting garrisons, facilitating supply lines, and allowing legions to move quickly in response to rebellion or invasion. If your destination did not lie along one of these strategic corridors, your journey would be less a ride along a road and more a rough stumble through a succession of minor tracks, agricultural paths, or animal trails. And yet, people still traveled, because even a broken thread of connection was better than none at all. In Egypt, for example, much of the ancient traffic followed the Nile, not because there were no roads, but because the roads were unreliable. The river was nature's highway, and people clung to its banks like vines to a trellis. The few land roads that did exist often paralleled the river but never matched its efficiency. Desert tracks branched off from the Nile, leading to remote temples or quarries, but these were service routes, used mainly by those with purpose and protection. The idea of casual travel, of simply deciding to journey from one city to another for leisure or discovery, was an alien concept in most parts of the ancient world. Travel, when it occurred, was driven by obligation, diplomatic, military, religious, or mercantile. In Greece, the terrain made road building difficult. Mountainous and broken, the land was stitched together by narrow, rocky paths that hugged cliff faces and climbed treacherous ridges. The polis, those fiercely independent city-states, had little reason to build extensive, interconnecting road systems. They competed with one another, often went to war, and guarded their borders with suspicion. There was no incentive to create a road that allowed easy access to a rival. As a result, much of the travel in the ancient Greek world was conducted by sea. The land roads that did exist were often crude, following the contours of the landscape, rather than cutting through it. In regions like Mesopotamia, road networks were shaped largely by the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, around which cities clustered. The land between rivers could be fertile, but also marshy or flood-prone, which meant that roads had to be adapted to the whims of the environment. Temporary causeways might be built in dry seasons, only to vanish with the rains. Bridges were rare and expensive, requiring considerable engineering and materials that were not always available. This made large-scale road systems difficult to maintain. Still, some roads existed, linking temples, palaces, and market towns, but they were often ceremonial or administrative in function. The common person rarely, if ever, used them. Perhaps the most organized of the ancient road networks outside of Rome was that of the Persian Empire. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,000 miles, was a marvel for its time. It allowed communication between the empire's core and its peripheries, enabling messages to pass in mere days what might otherwise take months. The Persians established a relay system of mounted couriers, an early form of postal service that allowed information to travel at a speed that was astonishing for the age. But even here, the roads were selective. They did not reach everywhere, nor were they intended to. The road network was designed to link the empire's political and military centers. The villages in the mountains, the shepherds on the steppes, the fishermen along the Caspian Sea, these people remained disconnected, outside the pulse of the road. The limitations of ancient roads were not just about physical distance or terrain. They were also about class. Who you were determined how you traveled. Wealthy travelers, merchants, senators, nobles could afford horses, carriages, guards, and provisions. They might be accompanied by porters or slaves, bringing comfort along with them. For such travelers, the road was still dangerous, but survivable. For the poor, the journey was something else entirely. They walked. They carried their possessions on their backs. They slept in ditches or beneath trees. They risked robbery, illness, and starvation, and yet they still traveled when they had to. This brings us to another essential truth of ancient roads. They were instruments of inequality as much as they were tools of connection. Access to roads, real access, not just the ability to walk upon them, required money, privilege, and knowledge. Knowing which road to take, where to find shelter, how to navigate unfamiliar territory. These were not givens. They were advantages possessed by those with resources, connections, or experience. The average traveler, especially if traveling alone or on foot, entered the road as an outsider, and the road offered no mercy. And still, the roads mattered. Imperfect as they were, these rough ribbons of stone and wood dirt held civilizations together. Goods moved because of them: grain, olive oil, wine, cloth, livestock, precious metals. Without the roads, trade would grind to a halt. Soldiers moved because of them: legions, phalanxes, cavalry units. Without the roads, rebellions would fester. Messages moved because of them: decrees, edicts, letters, rumors. Without the roads, empires would crumble under the weight of their own silence. It's easy to overlook this fragility in hindsight. Today, we think of connectivity as a certainty: smooth roads, flashing lights, highways flowing in every direction. But in the ancient world, connectivity was an achievement, not a baseline. It was a fragile promise made by a world that could barely hold itself together. Roads could be washed away, burned, blocked, or forgotten. And yet, the will to rebuild them was always present. Civilizations rose and fell, but the urge to connect remained, to build a path, even a narrow one, from one place to another. That was the heartbeat of society. The unpredictability of ancient weather. To travel in the ancient world was, in many ways, to live at the mercy of the sky. The weather, today so easily forecasted with apps and satellites and hourly predictions, was once a thing of mystery, feared and respected in equal measure. The heavens could smile upon a traveler, blessing their journey with clear skies and gentle winds. Or they could rage with sudden violence, unleashing storms, floods, snow, or blistering heat, and in doing so, erase any illusion of control a traveler might have had. The road, difficult enough on its own, became a shifting, treacherous thing under the hand of unpredictable weather. And unlike today, where shelter is rarely far away, the ancient traveler was exposed, bare to the elements, reliant on luck, instinct, and improvisation. The path ahead could be smooth one moment and swallowed by the sky the next. Weather was not a background detail in the ancient world. It was a force that dictated movement, reshaped routes, and claimed lives. Let us begin, then, with the rain. To us, rain may seem inconvenient. It may delay a commute or soak our shoes, but for the ancient traveler, rain was catastrophe. Heavy rain could dissolve a road entirely. Paths became slick with mud, carts sunk into the earth, animals stumbled and slipped, and travelers found themselves waist-deep in muck, unable to press forward or turn back. In mountainous regions, rain brought the terror of landslides. What began as a drizzle could quickly become a deluge, softening the slopes and sending entire sections of hillside crashing down. Those caught in the wrong place at the wrong time could be buried beneath rocks and soil. Their journey ended in a single thunderous moment. And then there were the floods. Ancient roads rarely had drainage. When the rains came, rivers swelled, low-lying roads vanished, and bridges, if they existed at all, could be swept away in an instant. In Mesopotamia, the land between rivers was fertile, but prone to violent seasonal floods that rendered travel nearly impossible. In Egypt, the Nile's yearly inundation was both a blessing and a curse. It brought life to the fields, yes, but also washed away roads, swallowed tracks, and separated towns by wide stretches of water. Those who depended on dry footpaths were forced to wait or risk venturing across flooded lands in makeshift boats, clinging to hope and the occasional branch. Travel during the rainy season required patience and nerve. There were no forecasts, no meteorological warnings, no barometric readings to warn a traveler of what was to come. The sky was their only guide. A distant thunderclap might signal a day's delay. A sudden change in the wind's direction might inspire panic. Travelers learned to read the clouds, to smell the coming storm in the air, but even the most experienced could be caught off guard. For many, the only strategy was to push forward and hope, to gamble against the sky and pray they would not lose. Yet, as dangerous as rain was, it was not the only foe. Consider, instead, the heat. In the deserts of Arabia, North Africa, or the central stretches of Anatolia, the heat was an invisible predator. It did not attack with violence, but with slow, relentless pressure. The sun would rise early and climb high, and by mid-morning, the road itself would shimmer with mirage and light. The earth would crack, the wind would dry your lips, and your sweat would vanish before it could cool you. For travelers in these regions, water was more than a necessity. It was the key to survival. But water was scarce, and ancient roads did not conveniently wind past wells or fountains. Sometimes days would pass without finding a proper source of water. Thirst became a dull, aching companion, one that sat on the shoulders and behind the eyes, robbing a traveler of strength and sense. Heat drained more than the body. It drained resolve. A traveler might start their journey full of purpose, striding confidently across the stones. But after a day in the sun, that confidence wilted. The mind became slow, the eyes blurred, and the skin burned. Sand burned beneath the feet. Leather sandals grew hot. Even the animals that pulled carts or bore riders began to struggle, foam forming at the lips, legs shaking, eyes dulled. And when the traveler did rest, there was no comfort. The nights in the desert were cold, yes, but the day's heat lingered. Tents offered little shade. The air hung still, heavy with dust and silence. And if the heat did not claim the traveler, then the cold might. High in the mountains of the Balkans or the Caucasus, or in the steep passes of the Alps, snow and frost waited silently, patiently. These were not places where snow merely dusted the peaks. Here, snow fell thick, deep, and fast. A sudden storm could bury a road in hours. What had once been visible was now an endless field of white, directionless and merciless. Travelers could lose the path and find themselves wandering in circles, or worse, walking directly into danger. Frostbite was not an exotic danger. It was common, expected, feared. The cold, numbed fingers froze supplies, shattered wagon wheels, and stiffened leather until it cracked like stone. And yet, travelers had to press forward. They had no forecast to tell them when the blizzard would end, no emergency beacon to call for help. Only their own instincts and the vague hope that they were still moving in the right direction. Firewood was precious, and if they ran out, the cold would begin to whisper death in their ears. The snow muted everything: footsteps, voices, the creak of the cart. It was as if the world itself fell silent, watching to see who would endure and who would fall. Even those traveling in milder climates faced uncertainty. Spring brought unpredictable winds, sudden storms, and fierce bursts of rain. Autumn brought slippery leaves and early chills. Coastal travelers had to contend with fog, which could roll in without warning and obscure the road entirely. In these moments, visibility vanished. The traveler could not see more than a few feet ahead. Every sound became suspicious, every shadow a threat. To move forward was to trust blindly in luck. Some ancient travelers tried to adapt. The Greeks and Romans, for example, often avoided travel in certain months. The sailing season was known, and merchants avoided roads during the worst of the rains or the deepest of winter. But not everyone had the luxury of delay. Soldiers, messengers, tax collectors, and pilgrims had deadlines, sometimes set by kings, generals, or priests. They could not wait for a better day. They marched through snow, through storms, through darkness, because they had to. And if the traveler was religious, then weather held another meaning altogether. It was the voice of the gods. A storm was not merely rain. It was Zeus or Jupiter expressing anger. A drought was not just an absence of water, but a punishment. A flood was not just a rising river, but a cleansing sent by a higher power. People made offerings before their journeys. They prayed to Poseidon for calm seas, to Hermes for safe passage, to whichever god watched over their region or the road. Temples and shrines were often built near crossroads or on the edges of cities, not just as places of worship, but as sanctuaries for the traveler to ask for mercy before continuing on. And in some cases, the weather seemed to take on a personality. A road might be feared not because of bandits or wild animals, but because it was known to anger the skies. Tales would spread of lightning striking the same hill, of winds so fierce they lifted travelers off their feet. In the minds of many, certain stretches of road were cursed, touched by divine displeasure or haunted by the dead. Superstition was woven into the very fabric of the journey. A sudden gust of wind might be interpreted as a warning. A strange cloud formation might delay a caravan. The ancient traveler walked not only through the natural world, but through a world of signs, omens, and whispered warnings. Despite all of this, the floods, the fires, the ice and wind, people continued to walk the roads because they had to. Because the road, dangerous though it was also the path to life, to trade, to communication, to purpose. Weather might delay them, might punish them, might test their resolve, but it could not keep them from moving forever. They wrapped themselves in cloaks, leaned into the wind, found shelter where they could, and pressed forward. Sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, sometimes chanting prayers or singing to keep fear away, but always moving. Always forward. And now, as you sit beneath your own roof, safe from the weather beyond your walls, take a moment to imagine it, walking alone beneath a vast, dark sky, the wind cold against your skin, the rain soaking through your cloak, your feet sliding in the mud. Would you have waited for the storm to pass, or would you have kept walking, one step at a time? And if you kept walking, what would you have told yourself to keep going? The slow march of progress. In the great story of human history, roads are often treated as background, the stage upon which events unfold, rather than a character in their own right. But roads were not passive. They changed the world. Slowly, stubbornly, across the centuries they reshaped how people lived, how they connected, how they understood space and time itself. And yet, for all the progress roads represented, that change was painfully slow. Every improvement came at great cost. Every paved mile was earned through suffering, and even the grandest roads of antiquity still left travelers yearning for something better. Progress, in the context of ancient roads, was not a line. It was a slow spiral, full of dead ends and forgotten paths. Many of the earliest routes were not even planned, but formed gradually as people, animals, and carts wore trails into the landscape. What began as footpaths between neighboring farms became tracks between villages. Over generations, those tracks widened into wagon roads, and in the hands of empire, those same roads were claimed, formalized, and paved sometimes. But even the empires with the greatest ambitions for infrastructure, Rome, Persia, Han China, could only do so much. Road building required labor, a vast and steady supply of it. In the ancient world, that labor often came from enslaved people, prisoners of war, or conscripted peasants. These were not paid laborers working for a better future. They were often forced, whipped, and worked until collapse. To carve a road into stone, to bridge a ravine, to fill a marsh, it all required a human cost. Each stone laid was an ache in someone's back. Each bridge built was a month, a year, or a lifetime spent in toil. When you walked a Roman road, you were not just walking on stone. You were walking on the exhaustion, the sacrifice, the silence of those who had no say in where the road would lead. The pace of change was not just physically slow, it was socially slow. The idea that roads should serve people broadly and equally was a notion still far in the future. Roads were for the military, for the tax collector, for the messenger carrying imperial decrees, the peasant, the wanderer, the pilgrim. They walked in the margins, always one misstep away from danger, always last in line for whatever improvement came. And even as new technologies emerged, better paving techniques, milestones, way stations, the vast majority of people felt little change. A road could take 1,000 years to cross a mountain range. It could take 10 lifetimes to connect two distant coasts. And still, people persisted. They walked when the roads were unfinished. They walked when they were broken. They walked through snow and sand and silence. Because the idea of the road, however imperfect, was irresistible. It promised connection, trade, news, love, reunion, escape. The road was not just a thing one walked upon. It was a hope one walked toward. The very act of travel became an act of belief. Belief that the road would lead somewhere better. Belief that the struggle was worth it. Even when roads failed, when they crumbled or were overgrown or swallowed by the earth, people kept moving. They forged new trails. They followed animal tracks. They navigated by stars and shadows. In this way, the road was always growing, always changing. It had no fixed form. One could argue that the road was not the physical path, but the pattern of movement itself. The memory of a route. The invisible tug that led a traveler from one village to another, even when no stone or milestone marked the way. Over time, of course, the roads did improve. The wheel was refined. Carts grew stronger. Animals were bred for endurance. Civil engineers began to understand gradients and drainage, the importance of elevation and curvature. Roads that had once flooded easily were raised. Bridges were reinforced with stronger materials. In the east, intricate systems of postal roads developed, including in the Tang Dynasty of China, where officials rode swift horses from station to station, changing mounts to carry urgent messages across thousands of miles. In the Americas, the Inca Empire developed an astonishing network of roads and rope bridges across the Andes, built without wheels, yet perfectly suited to their terrain. Still, none of this happened quickly. It took centuries for the idea of a road to become something shared, something designed for more than conquest or control. It was only in the slow march of history that roads became truly democratic, open, maintained, and reliable. Until then, the road was a gamble, a test, a negotiation between your determination and the world's indifference. And it was more than that, too. The road was also memory. Every rut carved by a chariot, every cairn built to mark a mountain path, every forgotten route, now overgrown with moss and roots. These things linger. They do not vanish. Roads remember the people who walked them, the laughter of traveling companions, the whisper of sandals in the dust, the creak of a wheel in the still morning air. These things echo in the stones even after the road is gone. The road, in a way, never dies. It only sleeps beneath the soil, waiting for someone to find it again. There's something beautiful in that, is there not? Something comforting. The idea that even the most difficult roads, the most perilous journeys, become part of something larger. That no step is wasted, that all movement matters. And now, with this long path behind us, we come to the end of tonight's journey. Conclusion. A road traveled in thought. You've wandered far tonight. From the crumbling footpaths of forgotten empires to the glistening stones of Rome, from the perilous silence of mountain passes to the burning sands of endless deserts, from bandits hiding in the trees to rivers swollen with rain, we have walked side by side, you and I, across centuries of roads. We felt the blistering heat, the biting cold, the tremble of cart wheels, and the quiet dread of getting lost. We've tasted the dust, listened to the wind, and watched the world turn around us as we pressed onward. But all of it has brought us here, to stillness, to rest. The ancient traveler did not walk forever. Even the most relentless foot finds a place to stop. Even the longest road ends eventually, in the quiet of night. So let your thoughts slow now. Let your breathing soften. Whatever road you've walked today, in body or in mind, let it rest beneath your feet. You've earned it. And tomorrow, if you choose to rise again, the road will be waiting. It always is. If you're still awake and you're not in a hurry to fall asleep, tell me, which part of this ancient journey spoke to you the most? Which road would you have dared to walk, knowing what it held? Or would you have stayed home, listening to stories just like this one, while others braved the distance? Whichever you choose, I'm glad you chose to travel with me tonight. Sleep well, traveler. And until the next time, may your road be smooth and your rest deep.